my Men Across Cultures presentation, I wanted to study an abstract group. 98% of mass shooters are male. I wanted to study this group given the current state that we're living in. I thought that it'd be very relevant to understand what is going on with these perpetrators and how we can make a difference. What can we do to end this gun violence and how to move forward so we're not stuck in fear and anger at these individuals.
The Violence Project has compiled a comprehensive database on mass shooters which utilizes the mass public shooting definition by the Congressional Research Service and is defined to mean a multiple homicide incident in which 4 or more victims are murdered with firearms within one event in at least one or more public locations such as a workplace, school, restaurant, house of worship, neighborhood, or other public setting. Their data covers the years from 1966 to the end of 2022. Historical influences on men in this culture begin with figures who may not have been known for wielding a gun but have been known for mass atrocities. According to David Noriega of Vice News, since 1966 found that the shooters typically have an experience with childhood trauma, a personal crisis, or specific grievance, and a script or example that validates their feelings or provide a roadmap. And then there's the fourth thing, access to a firearm. Case Study 1, 1966, first record in Violence Project database. 25-year-old white male, heterosexual, raised Catholic, married, no kids, 2 years of tumultuous work and personal life issues. Raised with physical and emotional violence and witnessed maternal violence. Year prior to event, parents divorced, worked with a therapist who he shared his desires with. Post-mortem autopsy revealed tumor. Theories presents that presiding tissue necrosis and location pressing on the amygdala could have contributed to impulsions and emotional issues. Case Study 2. Gang national news coverage as the event was unfolding set precedents for safety policies as well as a manual for other shooters in years to come. Physical health conditions of the perpetrators vary. Data is limited and often subjective on this topic. Not everyone gets an autopsy like Case 1. However, pain seems to have a place in 12 of the cases at least. Living with chronic pain can be debilitating and change your life, especially in a society with limited ways to help cope with pain. The next highest trend is neurological issues. These include brain tumors, brain disease, and other neurological conditions like polio. Altered brain chemistry can certainly alter states of consciousness, but even in Case 1, where evidence was strong, there couldn't be certainty that the individual committed these acts because of the tumor. The next big areas are high blood pressure and physical deformities. High blood pressure is a common trait among men and can lead to natural inclination towards stress and being prone to react to stressful events. Physical deformities can be a source of ridicule, like in Case Study 2, enhancing the need for asserting masculinity. Over 80% of mass shooters showed signs of mental illness, while 45% were formally diagnosed with some form of mental illness. Only 45 of the 189 showed no sign of mental illness. Nearly all the perpetrators had attempted suicide or had intentions to die in the acts. 113 of the perpetrators were diagnosed with a mental health condition prior to the shooting. Only 76 received intervention for this. Interventions include 36 being hospitalized, 32 of which were involuntary, 53 receiving counseling, 19 of which were involuntary, 43 were prescribed psychiatric medications, and 34 had some generalized form of mental health treatment. Perpetrator age ranges from 11 to 66. 2 notable spikes in the data occur at age 22 to 25 in the final years of brain development, and again between 41 and 45 in the beginning years of testosterone decrease. Testosterone is very much linked to masculinity, and in early 40s we start to see this naturally decline. 25 is the general age where brain development is complete, but sometimes this could occur earlier or later by a few years. 33% of the perpetrators were 25 and under, with 38% between 26 and 45. The numbers significantly decrease over the age of 45. By and large, perpetrators of mass shootings are white at nearly 53% of perpetrators. The next highest race is 21.2%, African American, with Latinx, Middle Eastern, Native American, and unspecified races coming in at less than 9% for each demographic. Only 47 of the shooters had no criminal record. Largely, religion was not a common factor among perpetrators, but of those who identified, Christianity made up 29.1%, with the next largest category being no faith at 10.6%. 11 of the perpetrators, for a sum total of 65 lives lost, committed acts for religious reasons or faith-based intolerance. Nearly all perpetrators identified as heterosexual. Only 7 of the 189 perpetrators identified as not heterosexual or were unspecified. While nationally, laws are being passed as a measure to protect children from the LGBTQ populations, 3 shootings with a total of 60 victims died because of homophobia in these mass shootings alone. Case Study 3. 29-year-old heterosexual male, American-born Middle Eastern man, Muslim, identified as Mujahideen, pledged allegiance and was investigated for affiliations to ISIL. However, substantial links have not been identified. Childhood physical and emotional abuse, as well as domestic abuse in home as an adult. The event was carried out at an LGBTQ nightclub. Doug Meyer conducted a study of the media coverage and highlighted homo-nationalist rhetoric being repeated in media coverage of the incident. This is to say that by and large, the focus was on the individual's affiliations or claimed affiliations to drum up support of Islamophobia in the LGBTQ community, highlighting that while LGBTQ communities predominantly sit at the liberal table, the sway to a more conservative political stance and possibly even more shared sentiment for violence could be the next logical step for some members of this community. Devastatingly, 42% of offenders were victims themselves of child abuse. Additionally, many of them suffered from adverse childhood experiences. 34 were victims of bullying, 20 were physically abused, 10 were sexually abused, 23 were emotionally abused, and 12 were neglected. Under secondary ACE, 24 were raised by a single parent, 44 had parents who were divorced, 8 experienced a parental death, 6 experienced a parental suicide, 17 were witnesses of maternal violence, 15 had parental drug abuse, 19 had parental criminal history, and 10 had an incarcerated family member. A whopping 50.3% of perpetrators were single, with less than 31% in a relationship of some form. Only 28.2% were confirmed to have children. 35.4% of them were found to have a history of domestic violence. Considering that many of them were not in a partnership, this is an astounding number. Case Study 4. 20-year-old white male, 3.5 to 4.0 GPA, history of childhood trauma. Mother was in jail for molesting him. Home life was militaristic with a purported underground bunker for weapons practice, barbed wire fence surrounding the home, and threatening signs around the property. Reports from others indicated that as a child, the perpetrator would threaten people he didn't like with violence and boasted about guns and ammunition in the family's possession. Home life was fairly secluded and relationships were limited. The perpetrator was pulled out of school to homeschool in sophomore year. The event occurred shortly after breaking up with a girlfriend and being fired from his job. FBI was notified by his employer 2 days prior of threats of violence. %of perpetrators came from a low or middle class upbringing, while across the board many of them had at least some form of college education. 101 individuals had unknown GPAs. In the 88 cases where the GPA was known, there is 2 sides of the spectrum, with 42% having a GPA of 3.5 or higher and 35.2% having under 2.0, meaning that the perpetrators most often were very high performing or very low performing academically. This comes with it added stresses and each additional intricacies in threat to masculinity. Again, over half of the individuals, 55.3%, were not working. We are starting to build the picture of possible isolation among these individuals. 52.9% had no community involvement. Very few had heavy community involvement, increasing where we should be focusing our attention in individuals. Individuals, by and large, had no romantic relationships, were unemployed, had no children, and lacked community involvement. Coupled with declining mental health, and as we will see further on, personal grievances left little opportunity for viable interventions, especially when faced with a great crisis. Contrary to the general beliefs, many of these men had no military service, with 5 of the 49 who did not making it through basic training. Again, military for some can offer the camaraderie and social support needed to thrive in life. 15.9% were immigrants, with 84.7% being natural-born citizens. A unique trend along these lines was the connection between Asian immigrant males and shootings that occurred on college campuses. This was a unique feature of this demographic and could reflect animosity around the cultural attitude surrounding academic rigor in this population. Most of the individuals had no affiliations to gangs, hate groups, terrorist organizations, or other radical groups. This may be shocking to learn as we commonly affiliate these acts to larger hate movements. Again, as much as we should seek deterring affiliation with these groups, it's another aspect of social isolation. We all want to feel like we belong. Many times, school counselors are overwhelmed and limited only to seeing students who have individualized learning plans in place. This is that they have extreme issues that are impacting their academic needs. Only seeing these children prevents those at risk who are still performing well in school. Spending weekly time with every child one-on-one allows building a relationship with a confidant who may be able to help in extenuating circumstances. There are 49.5 million students enrolled in the public school system. Having one counselor per 50 kids allows 30 minutes per week with each one, time for charting, and extended time for more critical needs. This would require 990,000 counselors in schools. Based on the median salary of $60,000, this would cost approximately $59.4 billion. Some ideas to fund this would be eliminate the $100 million in gun company subsidies that taxpayers provide. Increase and use a portion of sports and hunting licenses. Part of these funds goes towards preservations. Require gun manufacturers to pay for this. They currently spend about $13 million lobbying. Reduce part of the Department of Defense budget to pay for this, especially since they have $847 billion in missing funds. Excise a 10% tax on gun sales, which would create $1 trillion based on a $400 handgun and gun sales of $20 million in 2021. Adult Children of Alcoholics is a free adult 12-step program that deals with childhood trauma. Increased childhood interventional programs would be another route to consider. Currently, interventions, unless advocated by a guardian, are only warranted in school following academic disruption or societally following traumatic experiences. Case Study 5, 15-year-old white male, parents had purchased a firearm for him. School counselor had a 400-student caseload. Parents were contacted several times. Evidence suggests that the parents were also aware of their son's declining mental health, evidence of torturing animals, and statements of the perpetrator about hallucinations and paranoia. The individual also experienced childhood trauma and parental substance abuse. The day of the shooting, parents met with counselor and school administrators over a picture the perpetrator drew of him shooting a classmate. The parents did not pick up their son. This case study both highlights the burden of school counselors as well as the problems society faces of poor parenting. Nearly every single perpetrator had a documented grievance, something that, especially collectively compared to other warning signs, could have been an indication that intervention was needed. 53 of the mass shooters were believed to have had psychosis as a factor in the motivations. Like in Case Study 5, sometimes paranoid behavior and hallucinations are well known by their community. Only 34 of the perpetrators showed no signs of crisis prior to the event. 110 had signs of crisis in months or more prior to the event. Signs of crisis include mood swings, change in daily ability to perform tasks, depressed, agitated, abusive behavior, isolation, paranoia, and/or losing touch with reality. Sometimes these behaviors are very subtle, and many do not recognize the collective weight of these signs. Mental health intervention is imperative, but not just on a crisis intervention level, but a preventative implementation nationwide. Many perpetrators had concerns about their pathway to violence expressed, just as in Case Study 4, where the FBI was notified 2 days prior to the event. Behavioral threat assessments can aid in intervening on the holistic level. These take into account the whole picture of an individual with assessments as to their level of danger to society. In situations where intervention is warranted, methods are currently inconsistent and sometimes do more damage to the individual than promote success. These consist of preemptive incarceration and involuntary institutionalization, where promoting the individual's ability to thrive is not only the priority, but sometimes not even a consideration. Only 40% received mental health intervention, largely focused on containment rather than the root cause or the grievance. This is in the form of prescription medication, which may or may not be abruptly halted. Sometimes, due to socioeconomic barriers, involuntary commitments can be too short to experience mental rehabilitation and counseling that is sometimes court ordered, where the very nature of the relationship begins on hostile ground. We need to move beyond crisis intervention into the root cause and try to preempt these acts of violence from occurring. Mental health treatment is underfunded, expensive, and seen as a taboo, especially for men. How do we reach out to these men who are largely isolated and have societal reinforcements that suggest counseling is for the weak? These are already men who feel the need to assert their masculinity. Successful scripts are out there. One of the tragedies about these mass shootings is the bigger mass shootings are almost always followed by clusters of more mass shootings in copycat style. The more shootings that we allow to happen, the more refined these individuals become. Recent media coverage of shootings have reduced the coverage of the perpetrator. This has had some success in deterring from glorifying the perpetrator. In recent years, the trend has been to honor the victim and make sure we know who they were. Project Violence requires a special request for data collected and publicizes their research without shooter demographics. Stop glorifying mass shooters. Glorify the victims, the heroes, the survivors. Access to a firearm is the fourth shared aspect. Many of the events that caused more damage were carried out by perpetrators with multiple weapons, automatic assault weapons, and in some cases even heavy body armor. Data reflected here only goes until the end of 2022, leaving 7 years to go to get to the total number of mass shooting deaths for this decade. Yet we have already seen half as many victims of mass shootings as we saw in the decades preceding 2010. No romantic relationship, no children, no community involvement, lack of social connections, faith-based military community, volatile relationships, forced therapy. Who do they turn to? When they are struggling with childhood trauma, when they lose the only relationships they have, when they feel hopeless and lost, when they begin to experience hallucinations. The social vacuum is filled by someone. Often, the voices in their head become their only sounding board. These were once individuals who had promise, who wanted to belong, who had innocence. At one point in their life, they were not the individuals we remember them as. It may be too late to save the lives lost and the lost souls that caused it, but there's still others in need of someone to turn to.